Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is March 27th. It's Thursday. This is the weekly summary. Today is 538 days since October 7th, 2023. I wrote this update early this morning from Abu Dhabi. Kyle gave the live weekly update this week, and now I'm recording from London. A few key things from the last 24 hours. This past week, I wanted to make you aware. We've been talking about the documentary No Other Land about the South Hebron Hills, which won the best documentary at the Oscars this year. The Israeli army this past week arrested Hamdan Bilal, a Palestinian co-director of the Oscar-winning documentary. He was attacked by a group of Jewish settlers in the occupied West Bank, according to activists and Bilal's neighbor. As of this morning, he was unknown his whereabouts for a few days, and then it was announced that he was released by Israeli forces after being held. I also wanted to let you know that the Yazidi community has been calling for attention to the nearly 3,000 captives who are still missing more than 10 years after ISIS had control of northern Iraq and different parts of the Middle East. There was an article in Religious News Services calling attention to that community. I had the opportunity to spend some time with them during northern Iraq a few years ago. I just returned from meetings at the Vatican, and I'm so grateful for prayers for His Holiness Pope Francis and his improving health. It's been reported that he was so ill that his caregivers and physicians that he came so close to death that his medical team considered stopping treatment. Protests against Hamas's presence in Gaza have continued for the second day as Palestinians in Gaza have chanted slogans against Hamas in a rare show of public dissent. I talked this week about how dissent against Hamas is not uncommon privately, but publicly, massive displays are uncommon. Israeli overnight strikes on Gaza killed a family of 6, according to news reports. And then I wanted to summarize things that have happened this past week. Save the Children put out an urgent alert Friday a week ago saying that there are more than 100,000 children trapped in North Gaza as Israeli military operations have escalated. And that was only after 3 days of airstrikes, which have continued throughout this last week. And it's important to know that Israeli forces have re-entered Gaza and the Netzarim border. That area has been called a partial buffer zone. The situation in Gaza has continued to deteriorate. Food, humanitarian assistance has been cut off now for going on 3 weeks. In the past week, at least, there was a day, for example, where 91 Palestinians were killed in one day. The defense minister Katz threatened to annex areas of Gaza to Israel if Hamas refuses to release the hostages. He also instructed the IDF to seize additional areas of territory. The Israeli government voted this past week to dismiss the intelligence agency director Shin Bet's director Ronan Bar, which of course escalated domestic, political, and constitutional crises within Israel. And every day of renewed violence in Gaza has made the safe returning of hostages more unlikely, said the UN Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East. He said that to the Security Council. I wrote on Sunday this past week about what forced evacuations of people in Gaza in the north looked like this past week. Evacuation routes have been restricted. If people use streets that are not approved routes, they're often treated as combatants. Electronic barriers, arrests, there are checkpoints, aerial surveillance, continuous gunfire. Evacuees are targeted from the air. Vehicles were prohibited, so people were forced to evacuate on foot. And so those are just some of the realities in terms of the continued displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. On Sunday in Israel, the Security Cabinet approved a new agency that is enabling the displacement of Palestinians. The agency is established in the Defense Ministry, and the idea is if Gazans want to voluntarily leave, that the agency will assist their ability to be able to do so. In the occupied West Bank, the death toll since October 7th, 2023 has now reached 943 people. And there were continued escalations in the West Bank this past week, with Israeli incursions going on the 56th day in Tel Karam, the 43rd day in Nur Shams. 13 people were killed, including a child and 2 women. More than 24,000 people were displaced from Tel Karam alone, for example. Jenin, and these are communities where there is Palestinian resistance. Jenin has been under 62 days of Israeli military incursions. 512 homes and structures have been partially or completely destroyed. An Israeli army spokesperson said that a missile was launched from Yemen and was intercepted before entering Israeli airspace this week. And flights actually at Ben Gurion Airport were suspended and had to avoid landing at the airport near Tel Aviv because of that missile attempt. Last week, it was reported that 2 or 3 U.S. aircraft carriers were being sent to the Middle East. The USS Carl Vinson carrier was sent, and then later in the week, a second carrier began being headed there. They joined the USS Harry Truman, meaning that there are now 3 U.S. aircraft carriers in the region. An Israeli airstrike over the weekend hit a hospital in South Gaza's Khan Yunis, which caused multiple casualties. And this week, the death toll of Palestinians surpassed 50,000 people since the start of the war. An Israeli airstrike this past week killed a top Hamas political leader, Salah al-Bardawil, and his wife in Khan Yunis. And Al Jazeera reported what they described as relentless bombardment. There was another day where 65 Palestinians were killed, 2 Palestinian journalists. The bombing of the Nasser hospital, you'll recall that the attacks on hospitals are a violation of international humanitarian law. As I mentioned, there have been several days of protests by local Palestinians against Hamas, and a Gazan in Washington, D.C. posted about how some of the signs were saying things like "enough wars" and "our children's blood is not cheap." The Financial Times reported this week that the Israeli military has drawn up plans to reconquer Gaza in a bid to finally defeat Hamas, paving the way for a long-running occupation of the besieged enclave. This is where Israel would not only take control of the enclave, but they would be responsible for distributing humanitarian assistance. One of the people familiar with the deliberations said that Israel would not only take over distribution of humanitarian aid, that they had also recently assessed how many calories each Palestinian would require. That's directly from the Financial Times. From what happened starting this last week, it seems like the plan to take over Gaza that Smotrich described, the far-right minister, he said, Israeli soldiers should prepare for a long battle to finish the job. Gaza won't be the same Gaza that we've come to know in the past few decades. Israel has moved detainees away from the State Haman detention center, and according to reports by Israeli human rights agencies, the move away from that detention center has not corrected alleged abuses. The IDF issued immediate evacuation notices in several neighborhoods in Gaza City. And Netanyahu said at a hearing at the Knesset that the more Hamas persists in its refusal to release hostages, the more powerful the pressure against them will be in Israel's seizure of the territory. There have been continued protests within Israel. A highway was blocked this last week. Hundreds also participated in academic protests in both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And probes about the massacres on October 7th have also continued. One particularly about the Nova Music Festival will be presented to the families and victims and survivors next week. The UN is reducing its footprint in Gaza by removing a third of its 100 staffers in the territory. And Israel said that its forces fired at International Red Cross buildings in Rafah because of incorrect identification. There are also evacuation orders for residents of North Gaza's Jabalia. In terms of ceasefire and negotiations, there was a video that was released this week of 2 Israeli hostages, Elkanah Bobat and Yosef Chaim Elhana. I'd encourage you to watch that. They were kidnapped at the Nova Music Festival, and they called for people to hear their cry. They called for Israel to negotiate. They said of their fellow hostage who was released, "Why are you not telling them what it was like here?" They talked about how their lives were at risk because the Israeli bombing of Gaza has resumed. I really encourage you to watch that video. Their families released it and said that they wanted it to be seen. And Egypt made a new proposal aimed at restoring Gaza's ceasefire deal this last week. The U.S. and Hamas agreed. Israel has not responded as of yet. In the West Bank, I've talked about that a bit, but there also was an IDF report that a Palestinian man who was reportedly armed was about to carry out an attack, and he was killed in the West Bank by Israeli forces. I mentioned the case against Ronan Bar that was also put on hold. And so that saga has continued. The High Court of Justice froze the dismissal until petitions filed against his hearing can be heard. And police forcibly removed anti-government protesters from blocking lawmakers outside the Knesset. 9 people were arrested. Hostages' family have demanded that Netanyahu's confidant Ron Dermer bring us a hostage deal within the next month or that he resign. In Yemen, Houthi rebels overnight attacked the U.S. aircraft carrier, the Harry Truman. The Truman has been attacked numerous times in response to U.S. attacks all over Yemen, where the U.S. has been targeting Houthi militants. And I mentioned that the Houthis had fired a ballistic missile at the Ben Gurion airport this past week. In Syria, yesterday, the U.S. gave Syria a list of conditions that would be necessary to obtain a partial sanctions relief. On Tuesday, there was a report that 5 people were killed by the Israeli military in a strike in South Syria. At least 10 people were wounded. In that same incident, the Israeli media reported that the IDF was responding to an attack. In Lebanon, Israel on Saturday fired rockets into South Lebanon for the first time in months after rockets were fired from Lebanon into Israel. There were dozens of airstrikes and artillery strikes across South Lebanon in the most intense aerial assault on Lebanon in the last 4 months. Hezbollah said that the 3 rockets from South Lebanon were not theirs, and it's important to note that there are other militant groups in South Lebanon. The Israeli military said that it's launched more than 200 strikes across the region last Saturday. The death toll from one of those strikes in Lebanon killed 5, and then that number increased to 6 people. The IDF did say that they killed Hassan Kamal Halawi, the commander of Hezbollah's anti-tank unit on the southern front. Moving on to the U.S., the Trump administration accidentally texted a correspondent or reporter for The Atlantic its war plans. The U.S. national security leaders included him in a group chat about upcoming military strikes in Yemen. That was a huge saga in U.S. news, and senior officials' unprecedented use of Signal to discuss sensitive military information. The National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, said that he learned a lesson and it was not a serious glitch. Several Democrats called for Pete Hegseth's resignation over the incident and what they identified as an extraordinary security breach. That conversation, of course, is still continuing. The U.S. and Russia had conversations in Saudi Arabia, specifically about a deal related to Black Sea maritime ceasefire. And Columbia University agreed to a raft of anti-protest and restructuring measures because they're asking the Trump administration to back off of their threat to withhold $400 million in federal grants. The Trump administration on Friday notified a Cornell University student and a pro-Palestinian activist from Gambia that ICE is seeking his surrender. So those arrests of international students has continued. A senior Israeli delegation is set to visit the White House next week for high-level consultations about the nuclear program. And the State Department approved what would be the first sale of advanced precision kill weapons systems to Saudi Arabia for $100 million this past week. A federal judge yesterday ruled Columbia University should not give information about their student disciplinary actions to the House Education and Workforce Committee. This was about Mahmoud Khalil. And breaking news in the D.C. area was that a judge said the detained Georgetown researcher could not be deported for now. He was accused of spreading Hamas propaganda. It was also announced in D.C., and as a Christian who celebrates Easter, I was quite offended by this, but that the White House is soliciting corporate sponsors for the Easter egg hunt. That's a part of the White House Easter celebrations. And then I just wanted to let you know that next week we're having a webinar on a call to conscience, Bonhoeffer's wisdom for today's traumas in Israel with Dr. Andrew DeCourt and Rabbi Or Rose. I'd encourage you to join us for that. So that's an update, a weekly update. Apologies. That was a quick one. I went through it quickly, but may God continue to go before us. In the name of Christ. Amen.